Thank you, Lev, and thank you all for coming out. This is such a great turnout for a February 1st weekday evening. It's really great to see so many people here for this event. And I also have to thank the CCA. Always have a long relationship with the CCA. It's a fabulous museum. And I'm always happy to be back here and very pleased to be a part of this programming for the Greystone exhibition. This evening, what I'd like to do is I'd like to tell you about this recent project I've just completed in May of last year called An Enduring Wilderness, Toronto's Natural Parklands. It's a 5-year commission by the City of Toronto to document these areas in the city. And urban parklands are actually a very fascinating subject these days because most of us live in cities now. In the Western world, 8 out of 10 people now live in urban centers. And my hope is the book and the project as a whole not only serves to describe these interesting parts of Toronto, but also start a conversation about nature in cities. Because I think certainly the importance of green space in cities has grown in a big way over the last 2 decades. And one might even say that we're getting closer to nature through the city, just in terms of the new kinds of public spaces that are being created. But because my talk will be a little Toronto-centric, let me start with Montreal. And also let me just briefly talk about this previous commission I did with the CCA from 1989 to, well, finished the exhibition open in '96. And this was the Viewing Olmsted exhibition. It was a multi-year project, as Lev has said, that married photography and urban parks, and it provided myself and 2 other photographers, Phyllis Lambert and Jeffrey James, with the opportunity to visit 74 of Olmsted's major projects over a 5-year period. It was a remarkable commission, remarkable gift to me as an artist, I have to say. I always say thank you, Phyllis. It was a project that really allowed me to grow in so many ways as someone working with photography. But the goal of this was to really look at these major works by Olmsted, who did Central Park, the Boston Park System, Mount Royal, which is the only Olmsted park in Canada, Stanford University, the Biltmore Estate, parks in Buffalo, Rochester. The list goes on and on. Like, really, he defined this relationship between nature and the city in the 19th century, and it's something that we still enjoy today. But what was interesting about this was it also raised a lot of questions about photography and landscape and how these 2 things work or don't work together. And in one of the essays by former curator John Sarkowski, former MoMA curator John Sarkowski, he asked, he spoke about the kind of inherent problems around making pictures of parks. And he essentially discussed the idea that parks are, unlike buildings, are never really finished because they're natural forms. They're kind of ongoing works in progress. They're always in flux and change. And he ended up, posing the very poignant question that, if our subject is an idea constantly in the process of disappearing, where should we stand to photograph it? It's a good question, and one that, to some degree, I think all of the photographers struggled with. Phyllis, Phyllis Lambert, in her introduction to the book, cited philosopher Merleau-Ponty, who, in his work titled The Eye and the Mind, notes that the process of creating visual representations of the landscape, painters take their bodies along with them. It's a very important point. And their works, their final works, are produced through this kind of intertwining of the body, or the body as an intertwining of vision and movement together. And this is a big part of I think, photographing or visualizing any kind of space, whether it's natural or built. Your body is as an important a tool as the camera is. And indeed, I did discover that photographing these Olmsted parks was an intensely physical activity, one that required endless hikes with my camera in search of the images. And when I discovered them, I would inevitably need to incorporate a physical presence of some kind into the images. The other essay that was really useful for this project was written by the artist Robert Smithson, who's well known for his earthworks like Spiral Jetty. But Smithson did this wonderful essay called Frederick Law Olmsted and the American Dialectic. And he wrote it after visiting an exhibition in New York in the 70s that was about Olmsted. But the big point that he makes is that Olmsted's parks are not really all that natural. They're completely man-made. They're huge, elaborate constructions. And Smithson ends up describing Olmsted as America's first earthwork artist, someone who really shaped these landscapes into the kind of picturesque visions that we experience when we visit them. So, as I said, I had the opportunity to visit places like Central Park many times over a period of a few years. And it's true, each time I went, it was a different place. Often it was the result of changing seasons, but sometimes it was even just the time of day or the interaction of people with that space. They really were very difficult to nail down. But at the same time, in response to the points that were raised by John Sarkowski and Phyllis Lambert, I also discovered over time that Olmsted's best works directed me on how to move through the parks, and very often suggested where I should stand to make my images. In many instances, I felt my photographs, which were created in the latter half of the 20th century, had to some degree been pre-visualized by Olmsted more than a century earlier. He was that good. And people were also, the impact of people on the parks was something else that played into this. On one of my very first visits to Central Park, I arrived there 2 days after this very famous story of the attack on the Central Park Jogger. Some of you may be old enough to remember this, but it was a vicious beating and sexual assault on a young investment banker who was jogging in the north end of the park one evening, and by the time I arrived there, this had become what the New York Times called the crime story of the decade. There were 3 books about this story. There was a movie done about it, but it had an incredible impact on the park itself because it was empty. Never had I experienced Central Park, and never since have I experienced Central Park so empty and so full of fear. The only people I came across were the homeless population, like this woman in the blue raincoat, and police who were kind of stationed throughout the park to sort of try and restore public confidence. But as I said, viewing Olmsted really offered me an opportunity to explore some of the most beautiful landscapes in North America, and it also really allowed me to grow as a photographer. So, now on to Toronto, and this is some 25 years later, after viewing Olmsted was completed. But I was approached by a group from the City Planning and Parks Divisions to, again, do a multi-year project documenting urban parks. And this group had just completed a report on the environmentally significant areas of these parklands, these natural parklands. And the environmentally significant areas, all found within the city limits, contain forests and meadows, wetlands, and landforms, supporting an extraordinary variety of plant and animal life, and provide opportunities for people to experience this idea of wilderness in the city. In many ways, this commission was like viewing Olmsted, but the places themselves were actually quite different in that they had not been designed. They were not spaces originally thought of or conceived as urban parks. Rather, they are mostly remnants of landscape from pre-settlement times, often referred to as accidental parks, created through a confluence of circumstances over the city's 200-year history. And today they serve multiple purposes. They act as floodplains, as transportation utility corridors, and as urban parks. And just a little bit about Toronto. There's an aerial view. The lake's at the bottom, that blue bit. Toronto has grown exponentially in the last 20 years especially. It's recently surpassed Chicago as the fourth largest city of North America. And planners are suggesting that on its current growth trajectory, that by 2050, Toronto and the suburbs together, the greater Toronto area, will surpass Los Angeles. So this growth, this kind of densification, urbanization that's happened has put new focus on the green spaces in the city. And Toronto has a wealth of them. They're everywhere. They go across the city. And they used to go into the countryside in the north, but the urban sprawl has kind of enclosed all of these spaces now. They are kind of walled in by the built environment in a way that is just quite recent. The city itself is about 630 square kilometers and has these green spaces that, unlike Mount Royal, which rises up above the skyline, these are all sunken. They're often referred to as inverted mountains that they go down anywhere from 14 to 25 stories in what is otherwise a pretty flat city. And there's this wonderful quote by writer Robert Fulford, who says, "The ravines are to Toronto what canals are to Venice, hills are to San Francisco, and the Thames River is to London. They are the heart of the city's emotional geography, and understanding Toronto requires an understanding of the ravines." So they really have become a kind of defining feature of the city. And they're often written about by both fiction and nonfiction writers as a kind of soul of the city. Something that really makes Toronto not only livable, but what it is today. And this is another view showing the different kinds of parklands. This is just to show you that the areas I concentrated on were the orange ones, which are the ESAs, which are the more wild, natural, or renaturalized areas of the city parklands. But I also, in the 1980s, actually before Olmsted, did a small project on the Don Valley. And I'm just going to show you a couple of these pictures in relation to current day pictures because it shows how much nature can change over, in this case, about a 30-year period. So the Don Valley, when I photographed it in the 80s, was still quite industrial, and this is the brickworks. It was a factory that produced red bricks. It was a quarry, very active, but was closed down in the late 80s, and then over a 20-year period was renaturalized into a design park done by Montreal's own Cormier and Associates called Brickworks Park. Another area, this is just under the Bloor Viaduct in the Don Valley, and those are dirt bike trails. This was from 1983. And I found this wonderful line in one of the city planning documents that the ravine areas in the 70s and early 80s were referred to as space left over after planning. So it's just like, it was useless, it was neglected, it served no purpose in the city at that time. But just through, this is mostly city workers, have completely renaturalized this space and converted it into a parkland. A parkland that has an expressway, the Don Valley Parkway on one side, and commuter rail lines and hydro lanes on the other. So this kind of collision of infrastructure is a very important part of these spaces. So how am I doing for time? I'm good? Okay. So I'm just going to run you through some of these pictures and sort of speak to some of the things that I discovered over this 5 years of doing this. There are actually three of these river valleys. There's the Rouge, the Don, and the Humber, and then there's the Waterfront. There's one other section to the book, but I don't have time to do it tonight. So let me start with the Waterfront, which in Toronto, I think most people think of the Toronto waterfront of the kind of disaster that it is. It's been completely destroyed by development in the downtown core. I don't think it can ever be recovered. But there are a number of instances where the waterfront is quite natural. And here you can see, I don't have a pointer, I guess, do I? No. Okay. But down there on the left is the Toronto Islands, and up in the upper right is the Humber and High Park. And you know, in the top, your right-hand corner is the downtown core, the Sky Dome, the financial district. That's the true city. But to the extreme ends of the waterfront, there are still these very natural and very remarkable places. This is the Scarborough Bluffs, which is otherworldly. It's an escarpment left behind by a glacier, so it takes you into history back to the Pleistocene period. Great place for geology geeks. But is a place that is kind of otherworldly as a landscape, but also takes you back into, I always feel, a different time. These spaces are actually natural magnets for Toronto's burgeoning immigrant population. They're the truly public, democratic spaces that new arrivals go to, because it doesn't matter how much money you make or what you wear or where you're from. They truly are shared spaces that feature what is a kind of Canadian feature, the natural landscape, in a way that draws immigrant populations from all over the city. These are places that are still undeveloped enough and wild enough that you find instances like this where youth, mostly hipsters, the LGBT community, many others find secret places that are completely their own, or they think of as their own, that don't come with rules and regulations, that are separated from the rest of the city. This is another one. It's the new beach on Toronto Islands. It's Hanlon's Point. Wildlife. I saw every kind of wildlife over the 5 years doing this project. There was recently a black bear sighting in Toronto just this past summer in the downtown core. But this is on the Leslie Street Spit, Tommy Thompson Park, and it's a landfill site that's been renaturalized and become one of the largest bird sanctuaries in North America. This is the Humber River, and this is the largest river system. It's a former indigenous trading route that took natives, traders from the Lake Ontario waterfront up into Lake Huron. It's now in the west end of the city, surrounded by residential development. At the actual lakefront, there's a series of 11 bridges that carry cars on expressways, rail lines, transit lines, footbridges, other streets that create this kind of barrier to the waterfront. But once you're beyond that, you are in this very beautiful and natural wetland. This is the Don Valley, and it's the most urban. It's the closest to downtown, and it's the most used. And it's the one I live 10 minutes away from, so it's the one that is kind of my favorite. And that's of course the Don Valley Parkway coming down through the river valley. And as I said, these valleys, you know, from the street grid are about 14 stories down. And so there's a lot of kind of interaction with these spaces from the bridges. I did a lot of photographing from the bridges. And this is one of the ravines, Park Drive Ravine, which looks lovely, but in fact, it's in a bit of a crisis because of invasive species, the Norway maples, that are kind of disrupting these urban forests. As I said, it's a space that's heavily used by all kinds of different communities. This is a marathon run on Rosedale Valley Road. There's a big homeless population in the Don Valley, as there are in all urban park systems. There's a huge recreational kind of many groups. This is the mountain bikers who have endless trails that run through these areas. And there's this wonderful collision of infrastructure and nature in all parts of the Don Valley. And these are the kind of places that, to me, really make you want to question what a park is. You know, what's natural, what's urban. I think to me, they're some of the most fascinating places to be and to photograph. And finally, in the interest of keeping on time, I see Lev has just given me a 5-minute warning. I'll show you this final one, which is the Rouge Park System. That's the 401, the highway, the busiest highway in the world now, busier than anywhere else, going over what is the only national park inside of a North American city limit. And this is something that's just occurred in the last couple years. And it's a remarkable place because it really is quite natural. But again, you have these spaces like this under the expressway, this man fishing. And just beyond that, it is actually a kind of beautiful Carolinian forest, remarkable spaces where you really feel like you're in the wilderness. And you come across spaces like this that are truly wild, that are kind of impenetrable, that have been just left to grow and sort of take on this rather chaotic and very wild character. So I'll stop there and I'll finish just with one image. This is from Eric Sanderson's book about Manhattan, which is, Sanderson is a landscape ecologist who did the Manhattan Project, which is more about the ecological past of New York and the surrounding area, but this is in the future. This is a projection into the future, 2049, where he suggests that not only should Central Park in New York be expanded and other areas in lower Manhattan be expanded, but large areas of Brooklyn, Queens, and New Jersey should be converted back into farmland. So I think it's just a kind of wonderful springboard for discussion about how cities are becoming more natural. And this is a wonderful quote by Toronto's own, I'll say, Jane Jacobs, from an article she did in the New York Times. It says, "Perhaps it will be the city that reawakens our understanding and appreciation of nature in all its teeming, unpredictable complexity." And I'll say thank you very much.
Well, I'd first like to thank Lev and Phyllis for inviting me to this wonderful discussion about city parks and what they mean to our cities. And for Robert for agreeing to be here on stage with me. So when Lev first contacted me and told me about the series and what it meant, trying to put photographers and historians together, I was hesitant, but at the same time really interested. And I thought to myself, I could kind of talk about my own experience in the archives and trying to explain how images and photographs really helped me create a narrative for the history I was trying to unearth at the time. So the history I worked on was the Mount Royal's histories, but more precisely, it was the morality cuts of the 1950s. So briefly, the way I'll present this. I'll go through the history of the morality cuts, and then I'll go through the history of kind of myself in the archives and trying to figure out how textual archives as well as images and photographs kind of blend in together to give a better narrative and a better understanding of how this history happened. And I'll then conclude with some literature if we have time. We'll see. So between its year of creation in 1876 and the 1950s, Frederick Law Olmsted's Montreal Park, an emblem of Victorian romantic design, had hardly been manicured by the city. It suffered from a lot of cuts from the budget, and it wasn't even governed by the city parks department. It was governed by the public works department. And the result of this was that there was a mismanagement, and there wasn't really proper stewardship for the public landscape that was Mount Royal Park. And what happened at that point in around the 1930s and 1940s was the development of an area called the jungle. And the jungle on the northeastern flank of the park was understood to be a dense vegetation and overgrown greenery. And it was a really thick area of that really did not represent what Olmsted had originally designed. So the preoccupation with the jungle soon gained momentum. The authorities and newspapers declared that transgressive behaviors committed by, quote, undesirable peoples occurred in the jungle. Now, these behaviors varied in intensity and according to the source, and at times the newspapers described the jungle as infested with drunkards, criminals, or an interchangeable concoction of sexual perverts, or most nobly homosexuals who had found a safe cruising spot in the jungle and in the sinuous paths that Olmsted had created in Mount Royal Park. And furthering and catapulting the authorities' moral preoccupation with Mount Royal was the grisly rape and murder of a 9-year-old boy, John Benson, in February 1945. So the body was slashed and his head was buried in the snow, and it was very graphic. But the important part was that the Le Devoir, the newspaper, reported that never in the city's history had they seen the citizens so concerned about a case. And so Mount Royal Park became a space that really took the limelight of the city's preoccupation. So while the jungle began to increasingly evoke negative images in the public's perception, it continued to attract undesirable clandestine behaviors. And an often cited reason why the park attracted these people was especially the jungle itself with its dense vegetation and its unnatural, or its natural characteristics, but unnatural to Olmsted's design. So it was kind of a weird, in limbo kind of space. And so these ideas in the early 50s and after the rape and murder of John Benson, they got me to think about images. And so this brings me to the first series of images I wanted to show you. The Parc du Montréal, différents paysages. So when Lev contacted me and the CCA wanted me to talk about images and how they influence my own narrative, I thought about this series of images. And at exactly the same time as this dossier was created in 1953, we hear about the park being very unsafe for children, for women, for families. And so I thought, what's this man doing in here? What's the photographer trying to convey to us? Or in this one, why is this man alone? What's his purpose in the park? And these are the kinds of ideas that come to mind when I'm trying to historicize photographs and at the same time as other events are happening in the city and in the park. And part of this series, or this dossier, was also this weird picture of a squirrel ready to pounce at night. I mean, obviously the person who took this image probably could have taken a picture of a squirrel frolicking during the daytime. I don't know, like it just seems really weird to me. And this one's kind of haunting too. And then this other one also of this old man drinking his coffee and having a cigarette in the diner. Kind of reminds me a bit of Twin Peaks or David Lynch kind of style to it. So it's also very strange and very evocative. So this, like I said, this dossier was, as you can see, in 1953. 1954, a few months after this happened, we see a bunch of headlines really highlighting the fact that that the park was a dangerous space. So it's kind of, for the historian, it's kind of putting images and textual documents and trying to understand how they both come into play. I'm not suggesting, though, that the photographer necessarily wanted to put these men as dangerous people in the park, but it's just, these are the kind of ideas that are running through my head at the time. So in 1954, the reason why this series of headlines occurred was because there was a second rape and murder of another kid, a 6-year-old Raymond Tudreau. And that's when the city said, okay, we need to do something about the jungle. This place is really unsafe. We've never seen this before in the city's history. So though Mount Royal Park had been known as a place of relaxation, recreation, tranquility, especially for a certain faction of Montreal's population, it had now become a place of danger, a threatening place, a place where wretched people would come to convey. And at this point, the park reached a crossroad. Would the authorities either A, decide to redesign the entire park, do something about what was happening in the space? Would they only redo part of the park, which was the jungle? Or would they simply let it be and just let nature or wilderness bloom as it has for the past few decades? So ultimately, the decision of the authorities was to cut the park's trees, the bushes, the underbrush, whatever was part of the jungle. So really kind of clean it up, manicure the park, redesign it in a certain way that was still true to Olmsted's design, but that made it safer. And they also added lights so that at night people could go there and not feel too scared. So the decision to do this caused the park to become really to have like a lot of erosion because there wasn't enough greenery in the park, and that erosion caused the park to become even less green, which gave it its surname at the time, which was Mount Baldy or Mont Chauve. And this is the event called the morality cuts, so the cutting down of greenery for the purposes of the morality of the park being upheld. So now that I've given you like the story I was trying to unearth, I'll maybe run through a few images and kind of bring you into the archives where I went. And so this is the first document, and essentially the only document that was available before I undertook my history, or my research to create this history. And as you can see, the images are really poor. The quality of the writing was not very informative. It was only like 2 or 3 paragraphs, so I had to work, like really go into the archives and trying to figure out what it was we're looking at here, and if it actually happened, like the title of my talk says, it's in search of an urban legend or an urban myth. So I soon found the bottom image in the archives, and though the textual part of that document said that the morality cuts happened in 1954, I saw that that image that they used was not in 1954, it was in 1962. So I said, okay, well, we can probably go back and try to find when it actually happened. So I eventually found the geographical area where the jungle was. So it wasn't actually the entire park that was really dangerous. It was only just a section, the jungle as it was, like maybe a third. As you can see on the right-hand side, that's Park Avenue, and on the north, on the top part would be where the Camien Hood is right now, or Montreal Avenue. So I found, once again, an image that really detailed this. But when I found this image, I was really, it wasn't that great of a moment, because I had been looking for evidence of this in 1954, but this image in 1956 tells me that it's still pretty green, like nothing happened really at this point. The park still seems to be doing well for the month of October in 1956. So I had been looking at archives that were way too early, and people had indicated that it wasn't the time that it actually was. So along the way, images not only tell me how the park looks and stuff, but they also bring me to a more precise date, and they help me really create a narrative thread that is true to the history as opposed to what secondary sources might say. Here's another image that, if you see the date, January 21st, 2018, so this was last week or 2 weeks ago, so it's still current news, and this news article was essentially about the maple, the Norway maple. As Robert said, it's an invasive species. So once again, this article states that it was in 1954, and this was 2 weeks ago, so I was like, that's not true, and plus the image is really crappy. So why didn't they just use this image that was part of the archives, which they could have taken for their news article? So this is another series of images that really helped me understand the morality cuts a bit more. So, and it also speaks to another thing too, is that whatever the photographer is trying to take, it's not always what we'll use as historians. So for example, this series is interested in the man-made structures of the mountain. So here we see the tower, here we see the chalet or the belvedere, and for me, I don't really care about the chalet at all. I just want to see what the vegetation's like at this time, which we all agree is pretty horrendous. So essentially, this was part of the same series. Just look at the image on the right for now. So it was part of the same series, and the aerial photographer was obviously trying to either take into picture the Georges-Étienne Cartier monument or the newly constructed Camien-Aude roadway. But here we can see that the stark difference between the two images. So we know that like the cuts happened sometime between 56 and 62, and that they actually happened. So it wasn't just like an urban myth, it was something that truly occurred. But at this time, I was sort of out of my luck, trying to find more textual evidence or any more images too, until I went to a place where I didn't think I was going to find any archives, and that was at the Jardin Botanique. So if anyone's interested, the Jardin Botanique has an archive collection, and it was really informative. And this is another thing that Robert just spoke about, and it was the renaturalization of parklands by city employees. And so this city employee, Jean-Joseph Dumont, was really at the forefront of the push to regreen Mount Royal Park. And he was one of the only individuals who was ready to kind of bring this issue forward to the city, to stop the erosion, to stop Mont Chauve or Mount Baldy. And he was the superintendent of the Parks Department's Forestry Division. And so in his study, the Étude de l'état végétatif du Parc de Montréal, he also documented through a number of really stunning images how he and his team of the Forestry Division labored through the regreening of the park. And this happened in early 60s, in 61. And essentially, with this, I could piece together the history of the morality cuts, when they happened, and how we got to regreen the mountain, and what kind of work went through this, what kind of labor was essential to essentially just clearing the land, bringing in new soil to make sure that the mountain doesn't erode anymore and doesn't just flatten itself. At the time, they were saying that if it rained in the afternoon, or if it rained in the morning in Montreal, by the afternoon, a lot of soil would be flowing down straight to the St. Lawrence River. That was how fast the mountain was eroding at the time. But through the work of people like Jean-Joseph Dumont, we got the park back to a certain dignity that it once had. And in the span of 2 years, 1961 and 1962, they planted 60,000 trees in the park. So that's just in 2 years. And this brings me to another short series of images. And this one is from the City Archives by Raymond Gagnon. Once again, I just wanted to bring this point a second time, and it's that he was more interested in taking images of children playing in the park and of squirrels. Once again, if you guys go at the City Archives, there's a strange amount of squirrels in the images. I don't know why. But so once again, there's the image of the squirrel at the forefront with the kid, but what interests me is none of that. It's seeing the trees in the background, all newly planted. They're all young trees. And so it's just like furthering the point that in the early 1960s, there were a lot of trees being planted. And this is another one, too, where the photographer was trying to take an image of the newly built Camien Hood. But as you can see, even though it's wintertime, there were a lot of newly planted trees. Yeah, and so I think I have time just to say a few words on literature. Yeah. So this book came out in 1954, and it talked about how the mountain was a really dark and dangerous space, and how people would get murdered up there. And there's a few quotes if you care to read them. But essentially, this was how people pictured the mountain at the time. It was really a dark place. And this was at the same time as the rape and murders of the two young boys. And then, almost a decade later, in 1963, Leonard Cohen published this book. I think this is his first book, The Favorite Game. And yet, the collective imaginary, or the perception that the citizens had of the mountain, still seems to be as a place to avoid, a place where delinquents or perverts will kind of roam close to children and stuff. So although the cuts had happened, the idea of the park as kind of a scary place remained in the memory. So I'll conclude by just saying that photographs and images of parks do influence the history as a craft and as an academic discipline. They influence how we formulate our narrative and understanding of place, especially as it pertains to our environment, our ecology, and as it pertains, obviously, to parks. So, thanks.
Okay, thank you both very, very much. That was a sort of explosion of directions. The first thing I want to say is that, of course, this is still happening, right? The morality cuts continue at different scales in different places. Just down the street on Cabot Square, it was completely redesigned in the last few years, and all the bushes were eliminated, and basically the entire thing can now be seen from one police cruiser parked at the corner. So this is not something that's sort of resigned to history. Which brings me to my question, which is about this issue of the role of photography and the role of the visual and the prominence of the visual in these stories. So something like Mount Royal, which is in the middle of the city and sort of towering above it, it seems like the behavior there, bad behavior there, was more dangerous than behavior on the periphery. It's as if you have an infection near the heart. But I think this is rhetorical. Is my point. So if the jungle had been somewhere else, the Bois de Sarreguet or somewhere, would there have been an issue, do you think, even if there'd been a murder?
Well, there's two ways of answering that question. And the first of which would be, if you think about where the jungle is on the mountain, it's the closest area to Saint Laurent. So meaning people could come out of bars, be super drunk, and just go straight to the mountain and do whatever they wish in the mountain. And this was an issue that was highlighted a few times in the newspapers. They say the bars are too close to Mount Royal. It's too easy for them to go from the bars to the mountain. And it's also something that you didn't see on let's say on the Westmount Hill or on the other side in Outremont or elsewhere. So that's one way of understanding that. I think it's also maybe an issue of class too. So like kind of bringing it back to where it is geographically, it's closer to like at the time the francophone and the poor neighborhoods of the city as opposed to in Westmount. So that would have never happened in Westmount. Like it wouldn't have gone out of hand if it had. So yeah.
And this kind of image of the parks, I was really impressed by the cover of your book because the inside there's so much variety, right? There's all these different populations and all these different kind of uses of parks and different types of parks and so on. But the front, and I wonder if this has something to do with the commissioner, perhaps rather than the artist. It presents this sort of picture of affluent leisure, right? This guy on his bike, he's got a pretty expensive bike, he's got a nice riding outfit. And so, yeah, I want to ask you about the commission and sort of who you were making this book for.
Actually, the cover image I had to kind of fight for, interestingly enough, because when the people who work in the Parks Division saw it, they said, "Oh, that's an illegal trail. They're not they're not allowed to do that." So urban parks, I think, are such interesting places because there are so many things that you're not supposed to do that people do. I think this is one of the big attractions of the urban park, and there's really not a lot of rules in the same way there are in public spaces in the city proper. But the other thing that was so amazing about doing the Toronto park system was I never had any instances where I was worried for my safety. I did quite a few doing Olmsted, Prospect Park, actually Central Park. There were a couple instances where I thought, I need to get away from this person who's been following me for the last 10 minutes, or if I go around that rock where that person's standing, I'm going to get whacked over the head as soon as I make that turn into the bushes. So there's always this, this kind of mix of enjoyment of nature, this kind of, our very own Garden of Eden, with this feeling of evil lurking in the bushes that's a part, I think, of urban natural parkland spaces. But did that sort of get to your question about?
Yeah, I mean, I think in there was the commission, the idea of doing this book. Is it a kind of a propaganda for another kind of image of Toronto?
Yeah. No. I think going back, the city really wanted to basically make people aware of these spaces because they are oddly unknown to a lot of people that live in Toronto. And when they first approached me and with the idea of doing a book, I said, certainly somebody's done this book already. Like it's a defining feature of the city. Certainly somebody has made a book like this. And in fact, that wasn't the case. So it's another strange thing about natural spaces in cities is they don't get documented. They don't get kind of the coverage that the built environment does. Because people, I think, in one respect, assume that they just stay the same, but they don't. They change radically, as we've seen. Matthew's presentation was so interesting to see the difference between Mount Royal in the late 50s, early 60s, and even today. It's remarkable how much that's changed.
Yeah. I mean, I think I'd like to talk a bit about this idea of maintenance when it comes to buildings versus parks or built environment versus so-called natural environment. Mm-hmm. But I was thinking of the Greystone project as you were speaking, Phyllis, because of course that was a great effort to make something visible.
I really want to I have quite a few remarks I want to. Very interestingly, there was Dino Bombero did a book on Montreal from La Presse, with somebody from La Presse, and The photographs of old Montreal in 1950 show a place that does not look like the photographs I showed here, which was in the 70s, 30 years later. They were horrible. They were covered with stupid signs, and they were sort of junked. And so that's very interesting, of the immorality that sort of took over people's sense of thing. I mean, the fact that, well, when I went to college, I was at college in Montreal, in Vassar in the 40s or something, and Montreal is known as a fun town for not good reasons, and so I think this is quite fascinating. That this is huge change. So again, these photographs that were made in the 50s, I had not seen them before. Because why I took the photographs was because I was just very interested in how the city grew, what the issues were, and of course that really developed very deeply. But what was interesting to me just not from seeing your things, but having read seen your book, of course, and having read your paper, was that Burley said that the park systems are society's complicated relationship with nature inside city limits, okay? And your urban park shows social control, in essence. And Greystone buildings are evidence of societal evolution, so that the societal issue that relates to all of them. And when I think of the problems of the 50s and the attitudes, because things changed completely in these attitudes, the buildings were junked, and then they scraped off all that mess, or they replanted the mountain. I mean, really quite fascinating. And so what was so terrible? This was, actually Montreal lost its sense of itself at that time. What was interesting is that in 87 or 78, when Olmsted was doing the park, the Greystone buildings were they were on the way out of building with Greystone. And so Montreal lost that great identity it has of a very special architecture. Afterwards, buildings got built, okay? But, there was no real moment to them, so this question of social change, to me, is quite fascinating. And then, of course, nothing was built much, actually, after that, because, after the end of the century, certainly Greystone buildings were built. In fact, a huge amount of Greystone buildings were built, but it was by 1915, 1914, we had the war. That had been a very rich period before that. So nothing got built much during World War I. Then you had the 30s, the 20s, the 30s, the collapse of the economy. Then you had the Second World War. And so the only real change happened. Montreal changed completely in the 60s, after World War. And so these whole attitudes, and of course, we've been trying to work through from those horrible attitudes of the 50s. I hated Montreal, left it, just left it, I couldn't stand it. And I couldn't stand all the divisions, And when I came back, because I saw things were changing, and I couldn't stand the way cities were being killed in the United States by emptying the whole center of the city, and where everybody lived in the suburbs, which Montreal was not. And so it was very interesting to see that in that issue of identity. And then, of course, you have, I'll leave that there for the moment.
Okay.
Well, I was just going to follow up and say that one of the things I discovered doing the Toronto Parklands project was there's actually an enormous amount of history in these natural parklands, more so than there is in, Toronto has a terrible reputation when it comes to built heritage. It knocks down everything. It's one of the worst cities in North America, I think, for erasing the built heritage.
It has lots of contenders.
But I was so fascinated to find not just the history of colonial settlement in the natural parklands through buildings and areas that have been saved, but amazing indigenous history and even this kind of pre-indigenous history through these kind of interesting geological sites. So it was another kind of surprise to me, that because you don't think of parks as kind of historic spaces, you know, you don't think of them as kind of holding as repositories of history, but I think in most cases they are. They hold a lot of city history and as well as personal histories. Everyone has a story about any urban park when you meet them.
Well, that's what I think is so interesting about the two stories of the signs being taken off the old port and the trees being taken off Mount Royal, because of course with the trees in a certain amount of time no one knows, right? That's why I think the story is so great, because you can see the stages, right? The photographs capture them at these, to us, unrecognizable states, right? But with the buildings that you mentioned, Phyllis, kind of restoring them to some kind of authentic state is fairly straightforward. Right? You can remove the later signs, and you have the Greystone buildings.
Yeah, but it's also interesting that when Olmsted was working on the park, Montreal Park, cities were starting to have parks, city parks. That didn't exist before. I mean, there were the early things of the cemeteries, but that's a whole other kind of thing. But this was happening all over the United States at the same time. So what you really see if you start looking at them is that, first of all, cities had to have, they had to have mechanisms for cutting down the trees so they could build the cities. So they built the cities, and they built first of all the churches. Over here in Montreal, certainly, the stone is protecting you, and then you have to, then commerce starts. So you have to build those structures for commerce. Then you have to build the structures for the increasing populations that come. And then you finally start to get to more social things. Like in the 1840s, you had the Boxcore Market. Well, they had markets before, but that was that was just a horrible little wooden market. But there's a great, great building, So the British are sort of saying, here we are, but you're really doing something in this place. And then you get the church in the 40s also at the same time. They're building the church. So you get this extraordinary rich mulch of interconnecting and problematic issues that are happening. And it's not until you get to about the 70s or the 80s that cities, Montreal's probably developing in more or less the same way cities are on North America, or the major ones anyway, because that's when you start to get city parks. That is another change of attitude. I find that really very interesting.
If I may build on that, Prof.
Please do.
Yeah, a prof once told me this anecdote, but it's also very informative about how parks were this new concept in cities that didn't exist beforehand, and it went something like this. So when Parc La Fontaine was first inaugurated, people didn't know how to act in parks, or they didn't know what they were for, so they brought their goats to Parc La Fontaine. And so the police had to train people to understand what parks were for, and this man was saying essentially, what do you mean I can't bring my goat here? The grass is beautiful, the grass is perfect for my goat. And he said, no, this isn't what parks are for. You're supposed to just lounge and do other things, but don't bring your goat here. But it brings to mind this idea that people have to be conditioned to know what to do in certain public spaces, whether they be parks or in the 1870s or the 1950s or even today. Yeah.
Well, of course, I remember when the Lachine Canal parkland was created in the 1980s, I guess it was. Nobody used it. Nobody used it. And it took quite a while for people to get used to the fact. Of course, now you can hardly move there. But it took them quite a while. But so that, and that's true, I think, of having to learn how to use facilities.
And they, I think, embody so many interesting contradictions, right? I like some of the florid language in those newspaper headlines and the articles in your paper too, of this phrase, a viper's nest of perverts, which, this idea of spending too much time in the wrong kind of nature, doing the wrong things, makes you more like an animal, right? which is an interesting contrast because, of course, in cities, the idea of city parks very often, the lungs of the city is sort of, you spend time in there, you become healthier, you become more civilized, and so on.
It also brings to mind who the parks are for too, right? So the lungs to the city, it's kind of like a thought about how wealthy settlers thought about North America and how you get out of the city, you can kind of breathe better, and it's more for your health. And so you're bringing this into the city, so it's bringing a certain conception of what the rural area is supposed to be like, and that's the kind of like the elite conception too. So when the lower classes or people with transgressive behaviors get in there, they're unhappy with that, of course.
Well, that's interesting because, you know, in France, of course, Chaumont, places, they were very consciously made as places for you to breathe with the lungs, as was Mount Royal, of course, from as far as. But it was also spaces of democratization, where the rich and the poor, you mentioned that, you know, could mingle, and I think that is. And then there were also there was an interesting lecture given quite a long time ago in this room by Alessandra Ponte of the early parks that were made by corporate entities, which were controlled. So there was social control of the people who work for you.
Yeah. There's also very interesting work by David Gisson on this, actually the 70s and the 80s, how there was this sudden explosion of interior parks inside buildings in New York. So it was really around the time that Central Park was in crisis. And it was like, it was not a safe place to go, even as a photographer. And so corporations started creating these kind of luxurious atria for their workers to have some of this kind of experience and to draw people in also to the shops.
Well, there's also that notion now of the commons, which is, which, for example, in the Children's Hospital, here there's a big, we've been working with, of course, the city and the developer on that, we being the Table de Consultation des Grands Jardins, which is the area around here, Concordia, CCA, the developers that are developing stuff, these people live here, people work there, and such. We actually spoke to the city and actually put together a consultation on the commons, and which meant that how can people get together, how can they interact with each other. So it's the street, we're looking at how to redo St. Catherine Street, for example. And so it's the streets, and then, of course, the greening of the cities is all we're talking about. So that's the new phase now. I don't know what the next one will be. I hope it won't be cutting down trees again. But.
Yeah, this idea of sort of phases or duration makes me think of a question I wanted to ask you earlier, Robert, was, so for these long commissions, is it a question of returning, or is it simply it takes 5 years to go to all of them? Because I think it's interesting the difference between sort of the broad survey and then the spending 5 years going to the same spot in the park and really.
Yeah. Well, this was 86 sites. So Olmsted was 74. So this was 86 sites. And I figured that they added up to about 30 central parks. So it's about 35 square miles of parkland. And another wonderful quote by Robert Fulford from that book was, he said, a lot of these parks are sort of like private country clubs. You know, you kind of need to know someone to get you in, because they are, for the most part, kind of inaccessible. And it took me a year just to find my way into a lot of the spaces, because they're sort of secret. There's no wayfinding. The city's just starting to put wayfinding systems into them, and making, through online resources, starting to make more maps available so you can kind of figure out how to get from one part of the city to another, or from one point to another. But I think it's also it inevitably just takes you a long time to understand what are the important parts. I mean, it was the same with Olmsted. I was the youngest photographer of the three, and I was very dedicated, and I thought I really should try and cover the whole park.
You were the only one who did it photographed in color.
Yes, and I was the only one photographing in color, but I after about 2 years, I quickly realized that both Jeffrey and Lee were just kind of going to the places that they knew were the most interesting from whatever perspective. In Friedlander's case, like Central Park, he did the edges of the park, so it's really the interface between the park and the city, really concentrated on that, made amazing pictures. And Jeffrey, really kind of pinpointed the kind of original large open spaces in the park before going. So you have to really study them. I think for any long-term subject, you have to kind of study it. You have to make a lot of mistakes, and you have to be willing to go out and trudge around for a day and come back with nothing, and then go back again, a few days later or a few months later. Knowing that there's something there that you want to create an image of that tells an important part of the story. But it's hard work, I think, like it comes down to it's never easy, like even with all the new technologies that are available to me now, it's the same process of really being present and exploring with your body these spaces. Until you get to a point where you can make images that have some kind of meaning, that convey some element of that space that's important.
This idea of the secret parks, I think, is kind of interesting, especially in the context of that quote that you put up about these parks being Toronto's, I think, emotional geography or something like that.
Yeah.
It's kind of almost seems contradictory to me. Like, how could this be the most true representation of Toronto if most people have never been there and can't even find them and can't even go in there? Like, at least Montreal, like, you can't miss it.
Everybody knows about the ravines, though.
Yes.
Everybody knows about the
Yes.
ravines, where they've been in them.
Yes. Well, it's one of those things that everyone kind of knows about and has some idea about and has been to some part of it. But the other interesting part of doing this book was it was really the first kind of structured overview of all of them together. And Toronto was just amalgamated in the late 90s, when through the provincial government came in and took all of these separate boroughs and put them all together. So they haven't even been thought of. They've only been thought of as one system for just over a decade. Well, almost 2 decades now. But it's taking a long time, and there was no master plan for them. That's the other amazing part of this was
No
I thought
master plan for wilderness.
Yeah, well, you think there must be in some planner's office some future plan for how to develop these spaces to better integrate them into the city, to make them more accessible, to sort of use them for the future of the city. But in fact, that didn't exist. I was very surprised by that.
Well, there have been projects. There have been that great competition that Rem Koolhaas was part of, and
Yes. For parts, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That was, and there have been other plans, architects have been involved in.
Mm-hmm.
So there, what is the name of the Kim? She and her husband are very much involved in a lot of the work in the Kim Story.
Kim Story, oh yes, and James Brown, yes.
Yeah. And I mean, they're not architects in the way that Rem Koolhaas is in any way at all, but they've been very much involved in kind of also the flows of the ecological aspects.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's a lot of interest. There's a whole new interest in reworking green spaces because I think
everywhere.
Well, yeah, I mean, as cities get bigger and more vertical and denser, there is this basic human need to get away from your 500 square foot condo and your even smaller office where there's nothing but glowing screens and get into open natural space. There's I think a very big push from urban populations to create new, interesting public spaces that involve natural forms.
It's a bit of a cynical question, but I was wondering if that has something to do with branding, actually, because it's like when everything's getting urbanized, the sort of skyline, the traditional iconic representation of the city becomes less interesting, and maybe that's part of what's commissioning books like this, where Toronto now wants to be seen as the green ravine city, because that's really special.
Well, I was going to say that it's interesting. You said that nobody really does much about the ravines up to now. Mount Royal has always been a symbol of Montreal. The cross was put up there, 1643, the very first thing. And then in 1924, that big steel cross that's there. So Montreal is branded by that, if you want to say. So it's very interesting that again, I mean, I'm sorry about using the word interesting, but they are interesting.
Well, but I can remember a discussion with you, Phyllis, where you were talking. You were actually comparing Toronto and Montreal, and you said Toronto makes no sense. Montreal makes perfect sense because there's the river, the city, and the mountain. You know, like it all fits together so perfectly. Whereas Toronto has this, kind of complex network of sunken ravines.
It's more like Los Angeles, a more modern city.
Yes, but I think it's my feeling is it's just kind of starting to make sense of itself, just now, and making many mistakes along the way. But it's I think, and it's in part through this kind of new awareness of these of the potential of these green spaces. To add this other additional livable element to the city that's going to make that happen. And for example, there's another big project being done where the Don River, the mouth of the Don River, which was all channelized many years ago with concrete docks and so on, is being renaturalized. So there's these big kind of reclamations of natural areas being done.
Something I think it's been nice about your presentations and this evening is how much we're talking about the kind of activity, the sort of constant maintenance, words like renaturalization. Expanding the idea of these places as somehow found, because I think there's a really interesting contradiction there actually about around the word neglect, which I think has also been used a few times. Because that's like if we go to a place too much, it's not natural anymore. Mm-hmm. People kind of cover it, it gets changed and so on. But if we don't go there at all, it also kind of is, then it's abandoned, then it's neglected, then we're not taking care of it properly if we're talking about parks. Mm-hmm. And this.
Well, the city, like in terms of doing this project, their biggest concern is that these spaces will be loved to death because of the population. They'll be loved to death.
Of course, that's a great problem to trample.
Yeah.
The trample factor.
That's right.
The trample factor.
That's right. Well, it is. And Olmsted, like the designed Olmsted parks are so effective in terms of telling people where to go and where not to go. I mean, I think that's one of the great successes
and
of them.
And maybe where to photograph?
And where to photograph as well. But these spaces really retain this kind of wild quality, and people just go everywhere. It's like the mountain bikers. When they started doing their trails, they just thought, well, no one cares about this space. No one even knows about this space. So we're just going to do whatever we want. And the city, kind of found them and started working with them to say, no, you're destroying the hillsides through erosion, and we're going to work with you to create trails that you can use, but won't destroy the natural landscape. So.
One thing I've been thinking about too is like this idea of terrain vague, or like DIY kind of park space. So in Montreal, we see this like Champ des Possibles is one area where people kind of take it in their own hand to create a park space, and then the city will then take it out of their hands and create it into something else. Maybe not as DIY as it originally was, but I'm trying to think in Toronto, there's no such, well, like the mountain bike trails would be kind of an example of this, but yeah, you don't hear as much about like I don't know what the English word is for terrain vague, but yeah.
But there's a lot of do-it-yourself activity in those spaces. Gardens, like victory gardens that have been created, and flower gardens by individuals. I came across those, and trails. People creating trails. But also, like I found areas on Cherry Beach where people were creating spaces for raves, musical raves, like big crowds of people, because they were kind of, off the beaten path, and it was their own place that they had created for parties.
Yeah, I think I saw that at Halland's Point as well. Mm-hmm. Although that's a nude beach. I wasn't nude. I didn't participate. Anyways. But it's also on a smaller scale, too. Now you even see this like garden bombings, too. So like even small little spaces off of sidewalks will get what they call garden bombed, and people will use it to grow their own fruits, or not fruit, vegetables more than fruits, but yeah.